Okay, how's it going, everybody? I hope that you're all doing well. Okay, well, so in today's episode, I thought I'd try to briefly say something about the famous feud between the two French intellectuals, Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus. So, what was it all about? Well, let me first say that, if you don't know, I should make it clear that Sartre and Camus were at one time very close friends. And that's because they were united in their experience of the French resistance against the fascists. In fact, it's pretty interesting. They had even both read and admired each other's earlier books before they actually met in 1943. But suffice it to say, their admiration for each other didn't stay this way forever. No, not quite 10 years after their first encounter, they had a very venomous and public falling out. And that's what I want to try to talk a bit about. Okay, but before I get to that moment specifically and the reasons for it, let's first go back to 1946 and look at a series of essays that Camus wrote called Neither Victims Nor Executioners, published in the wake of World War II. So what Camus basically says in those early essays is that persuasion is no longer possible. And that's because we now live in a world, he says, not only of increasing machinery and bureaucracy, but also in one of absolute ideas without any subtlety. We're enmeshed in a world where people believe that they're entirely right in their political and in their ideological views, where things are black and white with no in-between. Now, Camus had in mind many societies or nations here, America included actually, but I think that he was mostly preoccupied with what was going on in communist Russia and what he observed as the rise of totalitarianism there. Something he was very critical about, but that, very importantly, other contemporaneous French intellectuals on the political left were not. No, in fact, several of these intellectuals seem to think that in one way or another, ultimately, history will justify or make sense of the violence associated with communist Russia. In other words, several of these intellectuals upheld the Marxist view that history has a meaning and an end, namely a conflict-free, classless society. And so they basically saw communism as building a better tomorrow. And so they saw the means used to get there, as disastrous as they may be, as necessary. Even human life, it seems, was viewed as subservient to the historical task. Okay, so all this was in the air at the time, but it wasn't until after the publication 5 or so years later of Camus' The Rebel that disagreements really seem to crystallize, that we get some very serious and very public arguments. Public debates that could have only happened in the high-powered intellectual life of Paris and France, by the way. I mean, their intellectuals were basically like rock stars. Anyway, so here's where we get to Camus and Sartre specifically. So in The Rebel, what Camus does is he explicitly condemns revolutions and revolutionary violence, including those associated with Marxism or communism. What he argues is that all revolutions, all political ideologies inevitably lead to authoritarian dictatorships. And not only this, but more importantly, what he says is that systematic violence committed in the name of revolution is completely unacceptable. And that's because, for Camus, simply put, the ends don't justify the means. You see, for him, that was the problem with ideologies or ideologues. Namely, because they evaluate actions on the basis of their success as ends, they see themselves as completely free from the domain of moral judgment, as completely innocent. In other words, the crimes of communism and the sacrifice of individuals was viewed as morally acceptable because eventually it was going to contribute to the salvation of mankind. to the noble end of communism. Well, again, Camus disagrees. No, the Soviet gulags were no necessary evil in the service of some greater cause. No, for Camus, what was important, what took precedence, was the plight and the dignity and the a priori value of the individual human being, and not some big idea. So Camus' solution in The Rebel was not to be a revolutionary, but to, well, as the title suggests, to rebel, which for him meant, among other things, a kind of moderate, incremental, and local defiance. One vigilant of only partial truths, not a top-down, dogmatic, and absolutist tearing down of things. Actually, right here is a good time to bring in Sartre, because in one of the first reviews of The Rebel, in 1952, I think, what Sartre accused Camus of, actually it wasn't Sartre himself, but a disciple of his, but what Camus was accused of was of being anti-historical and a moralist. Now, what does that mean exactly? Well, basically, the criticism of Camus was that by rejecting revolution and communism, he places himself outside of history. Which is to say, the criticism is that, according to Sartre, Camus takes a position of inaction or quietism. In other words, by rejecting the historical cause, Camus gets to stay completely pure and uninvolved and innocent and out of all contact with reality. Now, this is why Sartre called him a moralist, because he claims Camus wanted to stay uncontaminated. He didn't want to get his hands dirty. He didn't want to really choose. Now, aside from whether or not this accurately represents Camus' position in The Rebel, which is a question, it seems that according to Sartre, the intellectual, living in a world of social injustice and oppression, only really has two choices. They can either deny and live outside of history in the name of some moral principle, or they can participate in the battle for those wanting to become free. That's to say, they can side with the oppressed, even if this means that there's going to be some violence and sacrifice. In other words, even if it means adopting moral shortcomings. So I think that from Sartre's point of view, Camus' uninvolved position, as he sees it, is really just provided indirect support for imperial oppression. It just supported the status quo. Now, at the end of the day, whoever we might want to ultimately side with, I think it's possible to see the positives in each of their respective views. I mean, it's hard not to admire Sartre's powerful willingness to try to improve the lot of humankind, and to do so as quickly and as efficiently as possible through direct, efficient action. And I'd say that at the same time, it's hard not to listen to Camus' concern about dogmatic and dehumanizing ideologies and abstractions that ignore our sensitivity or our intuition or instinct for justice. I mean, as Camus himself says, justice is a concept, yeah, but it's also a warmth of the soul. So let us ensure, he goes on, that we adopt it in its human aspect without transforming it into that terrible abstract passion which has mutilated so many people. Bye for now.